What if I told you that just 50,000 years ago, Earth was home to at least 6 different human species? Not different races or ethnicities, but entirely separate species of humans, each with their own unique cultures, tools, and ways of understanding the world. And what if I told you that we, Homo sapiens, weren't necessarily the smartest, strongest, or most advanced among them? Right now, as you're watching this video, you might think humanity has always been a single species dominating the planet. But that's not true. For hundreds of thousands of years, this world was shared by multiple human species, each carving out their own evolutionary path. There were the stocky, powerful Neanderthals building fires in European caves, the mysterious Denisovans thriving in the high altitudes of Asia, the tiny Homo floresiensis, nicknamed hobbits, living on remote Indonesian islands. And others we're still discovering, whose bones are just now emerging from ancient sediments. But here's the haunting question that keeps archaeologists awake at night. Where did they all go? Why are we the only ones left? I'm about to take you on a journey through one of the most profound mysteries in human history. We'll explore not just who these lost human species were, but how they lived, what they created, and most importantly, what really happened to them. Because the answer isn't what you might expect. It's not a simple story of survival of the fittest or inevitable progress. It's far more complex, more tragic, and more relevant to our world today than you could imagine. By the end of this series, you'll understand why some of the smartest scientists on Earth believe we may have lost knowledge, abilities, and ways of being human that will never recover. You'll discover evidence that some of these species might have possessed cognitive abilities we still don't fully understand. And you'll learn how their disappearance changed not just the biological landscape of our planet, but the very nature of what it means to be human. But first, let me show you just how recent and dramatic this loss really was. Because if you could travel back just 40,000 years, less than a blink of an eye in evolutionary terms, you'd find yourself in a world that would challenge everything you think you know about human dominance. Picture this. You're standing on a windswept plateau in what we now call Europe, but the landscape before you is nothing like the Europe you know. Massive glaciers tower in the distance, their blue-white faces catching the low Arctic sun. The air is crisp and thin, filled with the sounds of creatures that no longer exist. Woolly mammoths trumpeting in the distance, the howl of dire wolves echoing across the tundra. But you're not alone in this ancient world. As you scan the horizon, you spot smoke rising from a distant cave. As you approach, you hear something that makes your heart race. Human voices. But these aren't the voices of your ancestors. These are the voices of another human species entirely. The individuals you encounter are shorter than you, but incredibly robust. Their shoulders are broader, their limbs more muscular, their faces distinctly different from any modern human you've ever seen. Their brow ridges are prominent, their noses wide and projecting, adapted for the harsh climate they call home. These are Neanderthals, and they've been successfully living in this challenging environment for over 300,000 years. As you watch from a distance, you witness something remarkable. They're not the brutish, primitive creatures popular culture has portrayed them as. Instead, you see sophisticated behavior that rivals anything early Homo sapiens were doing at the time. One individual is carefully knapping flint, creating tools with a precision that would impress modern craftsmen. Another is tending a fire, not just maintaining it, but controlling it with a knowledge of combustion that speaks to generations of accumulated wisdom. Children play nearby, and you notice they're being taught, not through formal instruction, but through patient demonstration and practice. An elder shows a young one how to identify edible plants, how to read animal tracks in the snow, how to prepare hide for clothing. This is culture being transmitted, knowledge being preserved across generations. But what truly amazes you is what you see next. On the cave wall, illuminated by flickering firelight, are paintings, not crude scratches or random marks, but deliberate artistic expressions, handprints in red ochre, animals rendered with surprising accuracy, abstract symbols whose meaning has been lost to time. These Neanderthals weren't just surviving, they were creating, expressing themselves in ways that speak to a rich inner life we're only beginning to understand. Now imagine traveling east across this ancient landscape. Through the Altai mountains of what we now call Siberia, you encounter evidence of yet another human species, the Denisovans. We know frustratingly little about what they looked like because we've found so few of their bones, but we know they were there, living in caves, making tools, and somehow thriving in some of the most challenging environments on Earth. What we do know about the Denisovans is perhaps even more intriguing than what we know about Neanderthals. Recent genetic analysis has revealed that they may have been the most geographically widespread of all ancient human species. Their DNA has been found in modern populations from Papua New Guinea to Tibet, suggesting they not only survived in diverse environments, but thrived there for hundreds of thousands of years. Even more fascinating, some of the genes we've inherited from Denisovans appear to be advantageous adaptations to high-altitude living. Modern Tibetans carry Denisovan genes that help them process oxygen more efficiently in the thin air of the Himalayas. This suggests the Denisovans weren't just surviving in these extreme environments. They were so well adapted that their genetic innovations are still helping humans today. But the story gets even stranger. Travel further south and east, to the islands of Southeast Asia, and you'll find evidence of human species that challenge our understanding of human evolution itself. On the island of Flores in Indonesia, archaeologists discovered the remains of Homo floresiensis, humans who stood only about 3.5 feet tall. These weren't children or individuals with growth disorders. These were fully grown adults of a species that had evolved in isolation on an island for hundreds of thousands of years. The hobbits, as they came to be known, had brains roughly 1/3 the size of modern human brains. According to everything we thought we knew about human evolution, they should have been incapable of complex behavior. But the archaeological evidence tells a different story. These tiny humans were making sophisticated stone tools, hunting large animals, and using fire. They were doing things that, according to our models of brain size and intelligence, should have been impossible. And they weren't alone. Recent discoveries have revealed evidence of other island-dwelling human species, Homo luzonensis in the Philippines, known from just a few fragmentary remains but clearly distinct from any other human species we've found. Each of these discoveries is forcing us to reconsider what we think we know about human evolution, about intelligence, and about the incredible diversity that once characterized our family tree. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. All of these human species, despite their success, despite their adaptations, despite their rich cultures and sophisticated technologies, began disappearing around the same time. The Neanderthals, who had survived ice ages and climate changes for hundreds of thousands of years, vanished from the archaeological record around 40,000 years ago. The Denisovans disappeared from most of their range around the same time. The hobbits of Flores held on longer, but they too eventually vanished, possibly as recently as 12,000 years ago. What happened? What could have caused such a widespread extinction of human diversity? For decades, scientists have debated this question, and the answers they've found are both fascinating and deeply unsettling. The traditional explanation has been competition. As Homo sapiens spread out of Africa and across the globe, we simply outcompeted other human species for resources. We were supposedly smarter, more adaptable, better at making tools and organizing ourselves socially. In this view, the extinction of other human species was an inevitable result of natural selection, survival of the fittest playing out on a global scale. But recent evidence is challenging this comfortable narrative. We now know that the story is far more complex and far more troubling than simple competition. Genetic analysis has revealed that these species didn't just disappear, they were absorbed. Modern humans carry DNA from Neanderthals, Denisovans, and possibly other ancient human species. This means that rather than simply replacing these populations, our ancestors interbred with them, creating hybrid offspring whose genetic legacy lives on in us today. But interbreeding alone doesn't explain the disappearance of these distinct species. If early Homo sapiens were regularly intermarrying with Neanderthals and Denisovans, why didn't these populations survive as separate groups? Why didn't we end up with a world of diverse human species, each contributing their unique adaptations and perspectives to the human experience? The answer, according to growing archaeological evidence, may be far darker than we'd like to admit. There are signs, scattered across multiple sites and time periods, that suggest direct conflict between different human species, evidence of violence, of systematic destruction of settlements, of what can only be described as warfare between different human groups. At some Neanderthal sites, archaeologists have found evidence of sudden abandonment, of fires that weren't cooking fires, but destruction fires, of tool-making traditions that simply stop midstream as if the people who practiced them vanished overnight. Similar patterns appear in sites associated with other extinct human species, suggesting that their disappearance may not have been a gradual process of competition and replacement, but something much more abrupt and violent. This raises uncomfortable questions about our own species and our relationship with difference. Were early Homo sapiens responsible for what amounts to the first genocide in human history? Did our ancestors systematically eliminate other human species, not because they had to, but because they could? And if so, what does that tell us about human nature and our capacity for both cooperation and destruction? These aren't just academic questions. Understanding what happened to our extinct human relatives has profound implications for how we think about diversity, about intelligence, about what it means to be human in the modern world. Because in losing these other human species, we may have lost far more than we realize. Recent research is revealing that Neanderthals and other extinct human species weren't the primitive, inferior beings they were once thought to be. Instead, they possessed sophisticated cultures, advanced technologies, and possibly even forms of intelligence that were different from, but not necessarily inferior to, our own. Neanderthals, for instance, were master chemists. They created the first known adhesives by heating birch bark at precisely the right temperature to extract tar, which they then used to attach stone points to wooden spears. This process requires not just knowledge of fire, but understanding of chemical reactions that wouldn't look out of place in a modern laboratory. They had to maintain specific temperatures for extended periods, something that demands both patience and technical expertise. But their innovations went far beyond tool-making. Deep in the caves of Spain, archaeologists have discovered Neanderthal paintings that predate the earliest known Homo sapiens cave art by at least 20,000 years. These aren't crude finger paintings, but sophisticated compositions using mineral pigments, showing an understanding of color theory and artistic expression that challenges everything we thought we knew about the cognitive capabilities of our extinct cousins. Even more intriguing is emerging evidence of Neanderthal medicine. At sites across Europe, researchers have found evidence that Neanderthals were using plants not for nutrition, but for their medicinal properties. Chamomile, yarrow, and others show up consistently in Neanderthal dental plants with known anti-inflammatory and pain-relieving properties calculus. This suggests they had developed a sophisticated understanding of pharmacology, passing down knowledge of which plants could heal and which could harm. The Denisovans, meanwhile, may have possessed adaptations that we can barely comprehend. Their genetic legacy includes not just high-altitude adaptations, but also enhanced immune responses to certain diseases. Some researchers speculate that Denisovans may have developed resistance to pathogens that our ancestors had never encountered, giving them a survival advantage in certain environments that we're only beginning to understand. What's particularly fascinating is that these genetic gifts didn't disappear when the Denisovans did. They were preserved in the human gene pool through interbreeding, and they continue to benefit modern human populations today. Inuit populations in the Arctic carry Denisovan genes that help them metabolize fat more efficiently in extreme cold. Pacific Islanders have Denisovan genetic variants that may have helped their ancestors navigate vast ocean distances. This raises a profound question. What other capabilities did these extinct human species possess that we lost forever when they disappeared? What knowledge, what ways of seeing and understanding the world, what solutions to problems we still face today went extinct along with them? Consider the hobbits of Flores. With brains 1/3 the size of ours, they were creating tools that required multi-step planning and abstract thinking. They were hunting animals much larger than themselves, suggesting sophisticated cooperation and strategy. They controlled fire and possibly even had their own language. Yet according to every model we have of intelligence and brain size, none of this should have been possible. This forces us to confront an uncomfortable possibility: that intelligence isn't what we think it is, that there might be forms of human cognition, ways of processing information and understanding the world, that we've never encountered because we eliminated the only beings who possessed them. Dr. Svante Pääbo, the Nobel Prize-winning geneticist who sequenced the Neanderthal genome, puts it this way: we are the only human form left. We have no idea what we might have lost. This isn't just scientific speculation. It's a recognition that human diversity once included not just different cultures and languages, but fundamentally different ways of being human. The implications extend far beyond archaeology. In our modern world, we often assume that our way of thinking, our approach to problems, our understanding of intelligence and success represents the pinnacle of human achievement. But what if that's not true? What if the Neanderthals had developed forms of spatial intelligence that far exceeded our own? What if the Denisovans had discovered methods of environmental adaptation that could help us face climate change today? What if the hobbits had unlocked secrets of efficient cognition that could revolutionize how we think about artificial intelligence? We'll never know, because they're gone. And they're gone, at least in part, because of us. But here's where the story takes an even more troubling turn. Because the extinction of other human species wasn't just a prehistoric event. It was the beginning of a pattern that continues to this day. The same forces that led to the disappearance of Neanderthals and Denisovans, the same human tendencies toward competition, conflict, and the elimination of difference, have played out repeatedly throughout human history. Look at the archaeological record of the past 10,000 years, and you'll see the same pattern repeating. Advanced civilizations, with unique technologies and ways of life, suddenly vanishing. Languages going extinct at an accelerating rate. Indigenous knowledge systems being lost as traditional cultures are absorbed or destroyed by dominant societies. The Tasmanians, isolated on their island for thousands of years, developed a unique toolkit and way of life perfectly adapted to their environment. When European colonizers arrived, this knowledge system, refined over millennia, was lost within decades. The same story has played out in the Amazon, in the Arctic, in remote islands and mountain valleys around the world. Today, we're witnessing what some scientists call the sixth mass extinction. But this time, it's not just species of animals and plants disappearing. It's human diversity itself. Languages are dying at a rate of 1 every 2 weeks. Traditional knowledge systems, accumulated over thousands of years, are vanishing as their last practitioners pass away without successors. This isn't just cultural loss, it's cognitive loss. Each language that dies takes with it unique ways of categorizing and understanding the world. Each traditional knowledge system that disappears represents thousands of years of accumulated wisdom about how to live sustainably in specific environments. Each culture that's absorbed or eliminated represents a different approach to fundamental human questions about meaning, community, and our relationship with the natural world. We're essentially repeating, on a global scale, what happened to the Neanderthals and Denisovans. We're creating a world where one way of being human, one approach to intelligence and success, dominates all others. And in doing so, we may be impoverishing our species in ways we don't even recognize. But there's another layer to this story that makes it even more significant. Because recent research is suggesting that the extinction of other human species may have fundamentally altered not just human diversity, but human psychology itself. The absence of other human species to compete with, cooperate with, and learn from may have changed how we think about ourselves and our place in the world. Anthropologists have long noted that modern humans seem to have an unusual obsession with group identity and competition. We're the only species that regularly engages in large-scale warfare, the only one that creates elaborate hierarchies based on abstract concepts like race or nationality. Some researchers now wonder if these tendencies developed precisely because we eliminated our closest competitors. When Neanderthals and Denisovans were still around, early Homo sapiens had to coexist with beings that were clearly human, but clearly different. This may have fostered a more nuanced understanding of what it meant to be human, a recognition that intelligence and culture could take many forms. But once these other species were gone, we may have lost that perspective, becoming more rigid in our thinking about human nature and human potential. This has profound implications for how we understand ourselves today. The racism, nationalism, and other forms of group-based conflict that plague modern societies may be, in part, a legacy of our species' history of eliminating difference rather than celebrating it. We may have become cognitively predisposed to see difference as threat rather than opportunity. Understanding this history doesn't excuse these behaviors, but it does help explain them. And more importantly, it suggests ways we might overcome them. Because if our intolerance of human difference is partly a product of our evolutionary history, then recognizing that history is the first step toward changing our future. But before we can fully understand the implications of losing our human relatives, we need to dig deeper into who they really were and how they lived. Because the more we learn about these extinct human species, the more we realize how much we've lost and how different our world might have been if they had survived. The discovery that changed everything came in 2010, buried in the dusty sediments of a cave in Siberia. Scientists were expecting to find more Neanderthal remains, more pieces to add to the puzzle of our extinct cousins. Instead, they found something that shattered our understanding of human evolution entirely. From a single finger bone, smaller than your thumb, researchers extracted DNA that revealed the existence of an entirely unknown human species. The Denisovans weren't just another branch on the human family tree. They were proof that our prehistoric world was far more crowded, far more diverse, and far more complex than we had ever imagined. But here's what makes this discovery truly mind-bending. We carry their genes. Right now, as you're listening to this, Denisovan DNA is flowing through your veins, influencing everything from how your immune system fights disease to how efficiently your blood carries oxygen. These aren't just ancient relatives we study in textbooks. They're literally part of who you are today. And the Denisovans weren't alone. Each new archaeological expedition, each new genetic analysis, each new cave explored is revealing evidence of human species we never knew existed. In just the past decade, we've discovered Homo naledi in South African caves, with their strange mixture of primitive and modern features. We've found evidence of mysterious human populations in Africa whose genetic signatures appear in modern DNA, but whose bones we've never found. The picture emerging from this research is staggering. At any given moment during the past 200,000 years, there may have been a dozen or more distinct human species walking the Earth simultaneously. Some were building sophisticated tools, others were creating art. Still others were developing unique ways of surviving in environments we can barely imagine. But here's where the story becomes deeply personal. Because recent genetic analysis has revealed something that changes everything we thought we knew about human purity and racial categories. There is no such thing as genetically pure Homo sapiens. Every single person alive today carries DNA from multiple extinct human species. If you're of European or Asian descent, roughly 2 to 4% of your genome comes from Neanderthals. If your ancestors lived in Papua New Guinea or Australia, you may carry up to 6% Denisovan DNA. If you're from certain parts of Africa, your genetic signature includes traces of at least 2 unknown human species that scientists haven't even named yet. Think about what this means. The racism and ethnic conflicts that have plagued human history, the notion of racial purity that has been used to justify some of humanity's worst atrocities, all of it is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what we actually are. We're not pure anything. We're hybrids, mongrels, the mixed-race descendants of a dozen different human species that once shared this planet. This discovery is forcing scientists to completely reconsider what species even means when it comes to humans. The traditional definition says that different species can't interbreed and produce fertile offspring. But clearly, our ancestors were not only interbreeding with other human species, they were doing so regularly enough that their genetic contributions are still detectable tens of thousands of years later. Some researchers now argue that we should think of all these different human populations not as separate species, but as subspecies or regional variants of the same basic human template. Others maintain that the genetic and morphological differences were significant enough to justify species-level distinctions. But regardless of how we classify them, one thing is clear. The human family tree was far bushier, far more complex, and far more interconnected than we ever imagined. This interconnectedness makes the extinction of these other human lineages even more tragic, because it suggests that rather than competing with each other, these different human species were actually cooperating, learning from each other, sharing knowledge and genes across vast distances and long periods of time. Consider the journey that Denisovan genes took to reach modern populations. Starting in the caves of Siberia, these genetic variants somehow spread across thousands of miles to reach Papua New Guinea, Australia, and the Pacific Islands. This wasn't a single migration event. It was evidence of complex networks of human movement and interaction that spanned continents and lasted for millennia. The same is true for Neanderthal genes, which appear not just in Europeans, but in populations across Asia and even parts of Africa. This suggests that the boundaries between different human species weren't rigid barriers, but permeable membranes through which genes, ideas, and innovations could flow. What kinds of innovations? Recent archaeological evidence is revealing that the exchange between different human species went far beyond genetics. Tools and techniques that first appeared in Neanderthal sites later show up in early Homo sapiens settlements. Artistic styles that originated with one human species appear to have influenced the creative expressions of others. At Château-Perronian sites in France, archaeologists have found evidence of what appears to be cultural exchange between Neanderthals and early modern humans. Neanderthal tool-making techniques show sudden innovations that seem to have been borrowed from Homo sapiens populations. Meanwhile, early modern human sites in the same region show artistic styles and symbolic behaviors that bear striking similarities to Neanderthal traditions. This wasn't just trade, it was cultural fusion. Different human species weren't just sharing genes, they were sharing ideas, learning from each other, building on each other's innovations. The diversity of human species wasn't just biological, it was intellectual and creative. But if these different human species were cooperating and interbreeding, if they were sharing knowledge and innovations, why didn't this lead to even greater human diversity? Why didn't we end up with a world where multiple human species continue to thrive alongside each other, each contributing their unique strengths to the human experience? The answer lies in understanding the difference between individual interactions and population-level dynamics. While individual humans from different species were clearly interacting, mating, and sharing knowledge, the larger populations they belonged to were still competing for the same resources, the same territories, the same ecological niches. And here's where the story takes a darker turn, because mounting evidence suggests that this competition didn't always remain friendly. At multiple sites across Europe and Asia, archaeologists are finding signs of what can only be described as systematic violence between different human populations. The evidence is subtle but consistent. Neanderthal sites that show signs of hasty abandonment, tool-making traditions that suddenly stop, as if the people who practiced them simply vanished, mass graves containing individuals from different human species, some showing signs of violent death. Most disturbing of all are sites that show evidence of what researchers euphemistically call resource competition violence. Places where one human population appears to have deliberately destroyed the settlements and food stores of another. This wasn't warfare in the modern sense with armies and battlefields. This was something more insidious, the systematic elimination of competition through targeted violence. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence comes from genetic analysis itself. When researchers study the patterns of interbreeding between different human species, they find something strange. The genetic exchange appears to have been heavily biased toward male Homo sapiens and female Neanderthals, or Denisovans. This pattern is consistent with what geneticists see in cases of population replacement through warfare, where conquering males mate with conquered females while eliminating competing males. The implications are chilling. It suggests that the interbreeding between different human species may not have been the peaceful cultural exchange that some researchers initially envisioned. Instead, it may have been the genetic signature of systematic conquest, of one human species gradually absorbing others through a combination of violence and forced integration. This doesn't mean that all interactions between human species were violent. The archaeological record clearly shows evidence of peaceful coexistence and voluntary cultural exchange as well. But it does suggest that as populations grew and resources became scarcer, competition intensified, and that competition sometimes turned deadly. Understanding this history is crucial because it reveals something fundamental about human nature that we're still grappling with today. We are a species capable of both extraordinary cooperation and devastating violence. We can learn from each other, share with each other, even love each other across the deepest differences. But we can also eliminate each other with a thoroughness that few other species match. This duality in human nature didn't emerge from nowhere. It was forged in the crucible of prehistoric competition between different human species. The same traits that allowed early Homo sapiens to survive and thrive, our ability to organize, to plan, to coordinate complex social behaviors, also made us devastatingly effective at eliminating competition. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of this story is what we lost when these other human species disappeared. Because recent research is revealing that each extinct human lineage possessed not just unique genes, but unique ways of thinking, unique approaches to problems, unique forms of intelligence that we may never recover. Take spatial intelligence, for example. Neanderthal brains were structured differently from ours, with enlarged areas devoted to visual and spatial processing. This may have given them capabilities in navigation, three-dimensional thinking, and environmental awareness that exceeded our own. Some researchers speculate that Neanderthals may have possessed a form of spatial memory so advanced that they could navigate complex terrain without landmarks, purely through internal mapping systems. Similarly, the brain structure of Homo floresiensis, the hobbits of Flores Island, was radically different from both modern humans and other extinct species. Despite having brains 1/3 our size, they were capable of sophisticated toolmaking, complex hunting strategies, and possibly even language. This suggests they had evolved forms of neural efficiency that that we don't understand. Ways of processing information that achieved remarkable results with minimal neural hardware. The Denisovans, meanwhile, lived in environments so challenging that their very survival required adaptations we can barely comprehend. High-altitude populations need to process oxygen differently. Arctic populations need to metabolize fats more efficiently. Desert populations need to conserve water more effectively. The fact that Denisovans thrived across all these environments suggests they possessed physiological and possibly cognitive adaptations that we've lost. What other capabilities did these extinct human species possess? What problems could they solve that we can't? What ways of seeing and understanding the world died with them? We'll never know, because we eliminated the only beings who could have taught us. This loss becomes even more poignant when we consider the challenges facing humanity today. Climate change, resource depletion, overpopulation, environmental destruction. These are exactly the kinds of problems that diverse forms of human intelligence might help us solve. The Neanderthals survived multiple ice ages. The Denisovans thrived in extreme environments. The hobbits lived sustainably on a small island for hundreds of thousands of years. Each of these extinct human species represents a different experiment in human adaptation, a different approach to the fundamental challenges of survival and sustainability. By eliminating them, we may have drastically reduced our own problem-solving capabilities just when we need them most. But the story doesn't end with extinction, because buried in our genes, preserved in our DNA, are fragments of these lost human lineages. And scientists are just beginning to understand what these genetic remnants might tell us about human potential, about capabilities we didn't know we possessed, about ways of being human that we thought were lost forever. Some of the most exciting research in human genetics today involves trying to understand what these ancient genetic variants actually do. Why were they preserved? What advantages do they confer? And most intriguingly, could we somehow reactivate them? The high-altitude adaptations inherited from Denisovans are just the beginning. Researchers have identified Neanderthal genetic variants that appear to influence everything from immune system function to pain sensitivity to circadian rhythms. Some of these variants seem to provide protection against certain diseases. Others may influence cognitive traits like memory formation or pattern recognition. Most fascinating of all, some researchers are finding evidence that certain rare individuals carry unusually high percentages of ancient human DNA. These genetic throwbacks may actually possess capabilities that are closer to those of our extinct human relatives. They may be living windows into forms of human intelligence and ability that we thought were lost forever. This raises an extraordinary possibility that the diversity of human potential hasn't actually been eliminated. It's just been diluted and scattered. The genes are still there, mixed into the modern human gene pool. We've just lost the knowledge of how to express them, how to activate them, how to nurture them. Imagine if we could somehow reawaken the spatial intelligence of the Neanderthals, the environmental adaptations of the Denisovans, the neural efficiency of the Flores hobbits. Imagine if we could reclaim not just the genetic heritage of these extinct human species, but their ways of thinking, their approaches to problems, their unique forms of consciousness. This isn't science fiction. The genes are real, they're measurable, and they're having effects we're only beginning to understand. The question is whether we can learn to recognize, value, and cultivate the full spectrum of human potential that still exists within us. But to do that, we first need to understand exactly what happened to these remarkable human species, how they lived, how they thought, and most importantly, how and why they disappeared. Because only by understanding the full scope of what we've lost can we begin to imagine what we might still recover. The clues to what really happened lie scattered across the globe, in caves, buried beneath millennia of sediment, waiting to tell their story. And that story is far more complex than the simple narrative of human progress we've told ourselves for so long. Let me take you to a place that changed everything we thought we knew about human extinction. It's called Spy Cave, located in Belgium, and what archaeologists found there in the 1880s would haunt the scientific community for over a century. The first Neanderthal skeletons discovered at Spy Cave seem to confirm every prejudice about our ancient relatives. Here were beings with massive brow ridges, receding foreheads, and robust frames that looked more ape-like than human. Early scientists concluded they were evolutionary dead ends, primitive brutes who simply couldn't compete with the superior intelligence of Homo sapiens. But here's what those early researchers missed, what we're only discovering now through modern forensic techniques and genetic analysis. Those Neanderthal bones from Spy Cave tell a different story entirely, one that's far more disturbing than simple evolutionary competition. When modern scientists re-examined these remains using advanced imaging technology, they found something the original discoverers had overlooked: trauma patterns. Not the kind of injuries you'd expect from hunting accidents or natural causes, but systematic damage that could only have come from deliberate violence. Cut marks on skulls, broken bones that healed poorly, suggesting repeated attacks. Evidence of what can only be described as torture. This wasn't isolated to Spy Cave. Similar patterns have now been identified at Neanderthal sites across Europe. At Krapina in Croatia, researchers found evidence of what appears to be cannibalism, but not the ritualistic kind practiced by some early human cultures. This was different, more systematic, more calculated. The bones had been cracked open for marrow, processed for every scrap of nutrition, as if the victims were being consumed not out of ritual respect, but out of desperate hunger or deliberate dehumanization. At El Sidrón in Spain, an entire family of Neanderthals, 12 individuals, including children, were found in a cave with evidence of having been killed and consumed around 49,000 years ago. Genetic analysis revealed they were all related, a close-knit family group that met a violent end. But what's most chilling is the timing. This massacre occurred right around the period when Homo sapiens were first arriving in significant numbers in the Iberian Peninsula. The pattern repeats across Europe. Wherever we find evidence of early Homo sapiens settlements, we also find Neanderthal sites that show signs of sudden abandonment, violence, or systematic destruction. It's as if a shadow was moving across the continent, and wherever it passed, Neanderthal communities simply vanished. But violence alone doesn't explain the complete extinction of these remarkably successful human species. After all, Neanderthals had survived for hundreds of thousands of years through multiple ice ages, volcanic eruptions, and dramatic climate changes. They were tough, resourceful, and perfectly adapted to European environments. How could a relatively small population of African migrants completely eliminate them in just a few thousand years? The answer lies in understanding something that archaeologists are only now beginning to recognize: the role of disease in prehistoric human interactions. When Homo sapiens migrated out of Africa, they didn't travel alone. They brought with them a microbial menagerie, pathogens that had co-evolved with human populations in Africa for hundreds of thousands of years. These diseases were devastating to populations that had never encountered them before. Think of what happened when Europeans arrived in the Americas, how smallpox and other old world diseases decimated Native American populations who had no immunity to them. Now imagine that same process playing out 40,000 years ago, but in reverse. Recent analysis of ancient DNA has revealed that Homo sapiens carried genetic variants related to immune system function that were significantly different from those found in Neanderthal populations. We were walking biological weapons, carrying diseases that our African origins had made us resistant to, but which proved fatal to populations that had evolved in isolation. The evidence for this pandemic scenario is subtle but compelling. At multiple Neanderthal sites, researchers have found demographic patterns consistent with population collapse due to disease. A sudden drop in the number of children's graves, evidence of hasty burials, sites that were occupied for thousands of years suddenly abandoned with no signs of gradual decline. Most telling of all, genetic analysis has revealed that the interbreeding between Homo sapiens and other human species was heavily skewed towards certain time periods. The genetic evidence suggests that most of the interbreeding occurred during a relatively brief window, right around the time these other species were going extinct. This pattern is exactly what you'd expect to see if disease was breaking down social barriers, creating desperate alliances between dying populations and the newcomers who carried immunity. But even disease and violence together don't fully explain the speed and completeness of these extinctions. To understand what really happened, we need to consider a third factor that may have been even more devastating than war or plague: ecological disruption. Early Homo sapiens weren't just different from other human species in their biology or their immunity to certain diseases. They were different in their relationship with the environment itself. While Neanderthals and other human species had developed sustainable ways of living within their ecosystems, Homo sapiens brought something new to the table: the ability to rapidly transform entire landscapes. Archaeological evidence shows that wherever Homo sapiens settled, dramatic changes to local ecosystems followed. Megafauna extinctions, forest clearance, altered fire regimes, changes to river courses. We were ecosystem engineers on a scale that the world had never seen before. This wasn't necessarily intentional. Early Homo sapiens probably didn't set out to destroy the environments that other human species depended on. But our hunting techniques, our use of fire, our settlement patterns, all of these had cascading effects on local ecosystems that other human species had spent hundreds of thousands of years adapting to. Consider what happened to the woolly mammoth, the woolly rhinoceros, the giant cave bear, and dozens of other megafauna species. These animals had coexisted with Neanderthals for hundreds of thousands of years, but within a few thousand years of Homo sapiens' arrival in Europe, they were all extinct. This wasn't just climate change. Glacial periods had come and gone before, without causing such widespread extinctions. This was something new. The extinction of these large animals had profound effects on human populations that had built their entire way of life around hunting them. Neanderthal tool traditions, hunting strategies, even social structures were all adapted to a world full of large, predictable prey animals. When those animals disappeared, entire human cultures collapsed with them. But Homo sapiens were different. We were generalists, opportunists, able to rapidly adapt to new food sources and new environments. When the mammoths disappeared, we switched to smaller game, to fishing, to more intensive plant gathering. When forests changed, we changed our tools and techniques. We were ecological chameleons, able to transform not just our own behavior, but entire landscapes to suit our needs. This adaptability was our greatest strength, but it was also what made us so devastating to other human species. We didn't just compete with them for resources, we changed the very nature of those resources. We transformed the world they had evolved to live in, making their specialized adaptations not just useless, but counterproductive. The hobbits of Flores Island provide a perfect example of this process. These tiny humans had evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to live sustainably on a small island with limited resources. They had developed tools, hunting techniques, and social structures perfectly adapted to their environment. They were living in harmony with their ecosystem, taking only what they needed, maintaining a stable population that could persist indefinitely. But when modern humans finally reached Flores, probably around 11,000 years ago, everything changed. We brought new hunting techniques, new tools, new animals, new plants. We transformed the island's ecology in ways that the hobbits couldn't adapt to quickly enough. Within a few thousand years, they were gone. This pattern repeated across the globe. In Australia, the arrival of Homo sapiens around 65,000 years ago coincided with the extinction of most large marsupials. In the Americas, human arrival around 15,000 years ago was followed by the disappearance of giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, and dozens of other megafauna species. Everywhere we went, we left a trail of ecological devastation that other human species, adapted to more stable environments, simply couldn't survive. But here's what makes this story truly tragic. We didn't have to eliminate these other human species. The competition wasn't inevitable. There were other ways the story could have unfolded. Recent archaeological evidence has revealed tantalizing glimpses of what might have been. Sites where different human species appear to have coexisted peacefully for extended periods. Evidence of trade, of cultural exchange, of cooperative hunting and resource sharing. These interactions show that peaceful coexistence was possible, that the extinction of human diversity wasn't written in our genes. At some sites in the Middle East, archaeologists have found evidence of Homo sapiens and Neanderthal populations living within a few kilometers of each other for thousands of years. They were using different hunting grounds, exploiting different resources, apparently managing to share the landscape without fatal competition. The genetic evidence of interbreeding suggests that at least some of these interactions were not just peaceful, but intimate. So what changed? Why did these peaceful interactions eventually give way to extinction and replacement? The answer may lie not in human nature itself, but in the pressures created by population growth and resource scarcity. As Homo sapiens populations grew and spread, the space for coexistence shrank. Territories that had once been large enough to support multiple human species became contested. Resources that had once been abundant became scarce. The buffer zones that had allowed different human populations to avoid direct competition disappeared. This is when the darker aspects of human nature may have emerged. Our capacity for group identity, for distinguishing between us and them, for justifying violence against those we perceived as different or threatening. These traits, which may have evolved as mechanisms for coordinating large-scale cooperation within groups, became weapons for eliminating competition between groups. The archaeological evidence suggests that the final extinction of other human species wasn't gradual or peaceful. It was rapid, systematic, and violent. At site after site, we find evidence of what can only be described as ethnic cleansing on a continental scale. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this story is how completely we've forgotten it. For most of human history, the fact that we once shared the world with other human species was literally unthinkable. Our myths, our religions, our creation stories all assume that humanity has always been singular, that we are the chosen species, the pinnacle of evolution, alone by divine design. This forgetting may not have been accidental. The complete elimination of other human species may have been so traumatic, so contrary to our self-image as moral beings, that we collectively repressed the memory. We created stories that justified their absence, myths that explained why we alone deserved to inherit the earth. But the bones don't lie, the genes don't forget, and slowly, painstakingly, science is recovering the memory of what we did and what we lost in the process. The implications of this recovered memory are staggering. If we are capable of eliminating entire human species, of systematically destroying forms of intelligence and culture that took hundreds of thousands of years to evolve, then what else are we capable of? What are we doing right now, in our modern world, that future archaeologists will struggle to comprehend? The parallels to our contemporary world are impossible to ignore. The same patterns that led to the extinction of Neanderthals and Denisovans are playing out today on a global scale. Indigenous languages disappearing at a rate of 1 every 2 weeks. Traditional knowledge systems being lost as their practitioners are absorbed into global culture. Unique ways of understanding and relating to the world being homogenized into a single dominant paradigm. We are witnessing, in real time, the same process that led to the extinction of human diversity in the prehistoric world. The only difference is that now, instead of eliminating different species, we're eliminating different cultures. Instead of replacing Neanderthals with Homo sapiens, we're replacing indigenous wisdom with Western education, traditional economies with global capitalism, local languages with English. The result is the same: a dramatic reduction in the diversity of human thought, human knowledge, human potential. We are creating a world where there is only one way to be human, one way to think about problems, one way to relate to the environment. And just as the elimination of other human species may have impoverished our genetic and cognitive heritage, this cultural homogenization may be impoverishing our collective ability to solve the challenges facing humanity today. But understanding this pattern also offers hope. Because if we can recognize what we're doing, if we can understand the forces that drive cultural extinction, then maybe we can choose a different path. Maybe we can learn to value diversity rather than eliminate it, to see difference as strength rather than threat. The genes of our extinct human relatives live on in us, dormant but not destroyed. Similarly, the wisdom traditions and knowledge systems of disappearing cultures can be preserved, studied, and integrated into our understanding of human potential. We don't have to repeat the mistakes of our prehistoric ancestors, but to change course, we first need to understand exactly how these extinctions happened. What specific mechanisms led to the disappearance of our human relatives? Because only by understanding the process can we hope to interrupt it. The story of human extinction isn't just ancient history. It's a pattern that continues to unfold around us every day. And understanding that pattern may be the key to ensuring that the diversity of human potential, rather than being lost forever, is finally allowed to flourish. In the depths of Denisova Cave, where that first finger bone was discovered, scientists have found something that changes everything we thought we knew about these mysterious human relatives. Layer upon layer of sediment, each one representing thousands of years of continuous occupation, revealing a story of adaptation and innovation that rivals anything achieved by early Homo sapiens. The Denisovans weren't just surviving in the harsh environments of Ice Age Siberia. They were thriving there for over 200,000 years. And the more we learn about how they lived, the more we realize what an extraordinary loss their extinction represents. Recent excavations have revealed Denisovan artifacts that challenge every assumption about human technological development. Jewelry made from polished mammoth ivory, carved with intricate patterns that speak to sophisticated artistic traditions. Tools crafted from materials that had to be traded across vast distances, suggesting complex social networks spanning thousands of miles. Evidence of controlled fire use that goes back far longer than similar evidence from Homo sapiens sites. But perhaps most remarkable of all is what genetic analysis is revealing about Denisovan capabilities. These weren't just another archaic human population struggling to survive in marginal environments. They were pioneers, explorers, innovators who successfully colonized some of the most challenging habitats on Earth and developed unique solutions to problems we still struggle with today. Consider their high-altitude adaptations. Modern Tibetans, who carry significant amounts of Denisovan DNA, can live and work at altitudes that would quickly incapacitate most other humans. Their blood carries oxygen more efficiently, their hearts pump more effectively, their entire cardiovascular system operates at a level of performance that seems almost superhuman to those of us adapted to sea-level living. But these aren't recent adaptations. The genetic variants responsible for these abilities are hundreds of thousands of years old, developed by Denisovan populations who were living at extreme altitudes long before modern humans even left Africa. They were mountain people, sky people, humans who had learned to thrive in the thin air of the world's highest places. Similarly, Denisovan populations in Arctic regions developed metabolic adaptations that allowed them to survive in extreme cold with remarkable efficiency. Genetic variants inherited from these populations help modern Inuit peoples process fats and proteins in ways that provide optimal nutrition in environments where plant foods are scarce. They had essentially solved the problem of Arctic survival through biological innovation. But the Denisovans' greatest achievement may have been their geographic reach. While Neanderthals were largely confined to Europe and parts of Western Asia, Denisovan genetic signatures have been found in populations from Siberia to Papua New Guinea, from Tibet to Australia. This suggests they were not just widespread, but successful in an incredible variety of environments. How did they do it? How did a single human species develop adaptations that allowed them to thrive in Arctic tundra, high mountain plateaus, tropical rainforests, and island archipelagos? The answer may lie in their approach to innovation itself. Recent analysis of Denisovan tool traditions suggests they were remarkably flexible in their technological approaches. Unlike the relatively conservative tool traditions of Neanderthals, which remained largely unchanged for hundreds of thousands of years, Denisovan artifacts show rapid innovation and adaptation to local conditions. They were technological chameleons, constantly developing new solutions to new challenges. This flexibility may have been their greatest strength, but it may also have been what made them vulnerable to replacement by Homo sapiens. Because while Denisovans were specialists, masters of adaptation to specific environments, Homo sapiens were generalists, capable of rapidly transforming any environment to suit their needs. When these two human species finally came into direct contact, the result was not a fair competition between equals. It was a collision between two fundamentally different approaches to survival. The Denisovans had spent hundreds of thousands of years learning to live within the constraints of their environments. Homo sapiens had developed the ability to break those constraints entirely. The genetic evidence suggests that this collision began around 50,000 years ago, as expanding Homo sapiens populations moved into territories that had been Denisovan strongholds for millennia. And what happened next represents one of the greatest tragedies in human history, because it wasn't just the elimination of a competitor. It was the loss of an entirely different way of being human. The Denisovans had developed forms of environmental intelligence that we are only beginning to understand. Their ability to read landscapes, to predict weather patterns, to navigate by stars and wind currents, to find resources in seemingly barren environments. All of these capabilities were encoded not just in their genes, but in their cultures, their languages, their ways of seeing and understanding the world. When the last Denisovan communities were absorbed or eliminated, all of that knowledge disappeared with them. We inherited their genetic adaptations through interbreeding, but we lost their wisdom, their techniques, their accumulated understanding of how to live sustainably in challenging environments. Today, as we face the challenges of climate change and environmental degradation, we desperately need the kinds of solutions that Denisovan cultures had developed over hundreds of thousands of years. How to live sustainably at high altitudes, how to maintain human communities in Arctic conditions, how to navigate and thrive in remote island environments, how to read environmental changes and adapt quickly to new conditions. All of this knowledge existed once. It was tested and refined over countless generations, and we destroyed it in a few thousand years of expansion and conquest. But the story of what we lost becomes even more poignant when we consider the other human species that shared our prehistoric world, because each of them had developed their own unique solutions to the challenges of human existence, their own forms of intelligence and innovation that complemented and enhanced human potential. The Neanderthals, for instance, weren't just the brutish cave dwellers of popular imagination. They were master chemists, environmental engineers, and perhaps most remarkably, they may have possessed forms of spatial and visual intelligence that far exceeded our own. Recent analysis of Neanderthal brain structure has revealed that their visual cortex was significantly larger than ours, suggesting enhanced abilities in spatial processing, pattern recognition, and environmental awareness. They may have been able to navigate complex terrain without landmarks, to track animals by reading subtle environmental cues that we couldn't even perceive, to understand three-dimensional relationships in ways that would seem almost supernatural to modern humans. These capabilities weren't just theoretical. Archaeological evidence shows that Neanderthals were creating sophisticated composite tools, building complex structures, and engaging in long-distance planning that required remarkable spatial intelligence. They were also creating art, not crude scratches or random marks, but sophisticated compositions that demonstrate advanced understanding of visual principles we're only beginning to appreciate. Some researchers now believe that Neanderthal visual and spatial intelligence may have been the foundation for entirely different forms of human consciousness. While Homo sapiens developed language-based thinking, abstract reasoning, and symbolic manipulation, Neanderthals may have developed visual spatial thinking, pattern-based reasoning, and environmental intuition. Neither approach was superior to the other. They were simply different ways of processing information, different forms of intelligence that could have complemented each other beautifully if both species had survived. Imagine a world where Neanderthal spatial intelligence could be combined with Homo sapiens' abstract reasoning, where Denisovan environmental adaptations could be integrated with modern technological capabilities, where the neural efficiency of the Flores hobbits could inform our understanding of cognitive optimization. Instead of having access to this incredible diversity of human intelligence, we're left with a single approach to thinking, a single way of processing information, a single form of consciousness. We've essentially reduced human cognitive potential to a fraction of what it could have been. But perhaps the most tragic loss of all was the elimination of the Flores hobbits, Homo floresiensis, because their extinction represents the loss of something truly extraordinary. Proof that intelligence doesn't require large brains, that consciousness can emerge from entirely different neural architectures than our own. The hobbits had brains roughly 1/3 the size of ours, smaller than those of chimpanzees. According to every model of human evolution and cognitive development, they should have been incapable of complex behavior. But the archaeological evidence tells a radically different story. These tiny humans were making sophisticated stone tools, using techniques that required multi-step planning and abstract thinking. They were hunting animals much larger than themselves, suggesting complex cooperation and strategic planning. They were using fire, possibly cooking food, and may even have had their own language and cultural traditions. Most remarkably, they were doing all of this with neural hardware that was supposedly inadequate for complex cognition. This suggests they had evolved forms of neural efficiency, ways of organizing and processing information that we don't understand and may never be able to replicate. The implications are staggering. If the hobbits could achieve complex cognition with such small brains, what does that tell us about the relationship between brain size and intelligence? What does it suggest about the potential for artificial intelligence, for cognitive enhancement, for understanding consciousness itself? We'll never know, because they're gone. The last populations of Homo floresiensis disappeared around 12,000 years ago, possibly when modern humans finally reached their island home. With them died not just another human species, but an entirely different approach to consciousness, a unique solution to the problem of intelligence that had taken hundreds of thousands of years to evolve. The loss of these different forms of human intelligence represents more than just biological extinction. It represents the elimination of alternative ways of understanding reality, different approaches to problem solving, unique perspectives on what it means to be conscious beings in a complex world. Today, as we struggle with challenges that seem to require new forms of thinking, new approaches to complex problems, we're handicapped by our own cognitive limitations. We're trying to solve 21st century problems with a single form of human intelligence, the only one that survived the prehistoric extinctions. But what if we didn't have to? What if, buried in our genes, preserved in our DNA, are the blueprints for these lost forms of human intelligence? What if we could somehow reactivate the spatial intelligence of the Neanderthals, the environmental intuition of the Denisovans, the neural efficiency of the Flores hobbits? Recent advances in genetics and neuroscience suggest that this may not be pure fantasy. we're beginning to understand how specific genetic variants influence brain structure and cognitive function. We're developing techniques that could potentially activate dormant genetic pathways, enhance specific cognitive abilities, even alter consciousness itself. The genes are still there, scattered throughout the modern human population, waiting to be understood and potentially expressed. We carry within us the genetic heritage of all these extinct human species, the biological foundation for forms of intelligence and consciousness that we thought were lost forever. But recovering this heritage will require more than just genetic manipulation. It will require a fundamental shift in how we think about human diversity, human potential, and what it means to be human in the first place. Because the real tragedy of human extinction isn't just that we lost these other species, it's that we lost the understanding that there could be multiple ways of being human, multiple forms of intelligence, multiple approaches to consciousness and cognition. We became trapped in the illusion that our way of thinking, our form of consciousness, our approach to reality, was the only valid one. This illusion has impoverished not just our understanding of human potential, but our ability to solve the complex challenges facing our species today. We need cognitive diversity, intellectual biodiversity, multiple forms of human intelligence working together to address problems that may be too complex for any single approach to solve. The story of our extinct human relatives isn't just about the past. It's about the future, about what we might still become, about the potential that still exists within us waiting to be unlocked. But first, we need to understand exactly how and why these remarkable human species disappeared. Because only by facing the full truth of what we did and what we lost can we hope to make different choices going forward. The evidence for what really happened lies buried in the most unlikely places. Not just in the grand caves where we found their bones, but in microscopic traces of pollen, in chemical signatures trapped in ancient ice, in the genetic ghosts that still whisper through our bloodstream today. And when scientists began piecing together these fragments, what emerged was a story so complex, so devastating in its implications, that it challenged everything we thought we knew about human nature itself. Let me take you to a laboratory in Leipzig, Germany, where one of the most disturbing discoveries in human history was made not with shovels and brushes, but with machines that can read the very language of life itself. In 2010, when Svante Pääbo's team successfully sequenced the Neanderthal genome, they expected to find confirmation of what everyone already believed, that these ancient humans were our distant cousins, related to us, but fundamentally separate, evolutionary dead ends that had simply been outcompeted by superior Homo sapiens. Instead, they found something that shattered that comfortable narrative entirely. Neanderthal DNA wasn't just in museum specimens, it was in living people. Right now, as you listen to this, roughly 2 to 4% of your genome, if you're of non-African descent, consists of Neanderthal genes. Genes that are actively influencing your immune system, your skin color, your hair texture, even your susceptibility to certain diseases. But here's where the discovery becomes truly unsettling. The pattern of genetic inheritance wasn't random. It wasn't the signature of peaceful interbreeding between equal populations. Instead, the genetic evidence revealed something that made researchers deeply uncomfortable, a pattern consistent with systematic conquest and absorption. The Neanderthal genes that survived in modern humans are heavily skewed towards certain types. Immune system genes, metabolic genes, genes related to skin and hair. These were preserved because they provided advantages to the hybrid offspring. But genes related to brain function, to cognitive processes, to the very essence of what made Neanderthals unique, these are largely absent from modern human populations. This isn't accidental. It's the signature of selection, both natural and possibly artificial. The genetic variants that made hybrid offspring more successful were preserved. The ones that made them different, that carried the cognitive signature of Neanderthal consciousness, were systematically eliminated over thousands of years. Dr. John Hawkes, one of the world's leading experts on ancient human genetics, puts it bluntly. We didn't just absorb the Neanderthals, we digested them. We kept the parts of their genome that made us stronger and discarded the parts that made them who they were. The same pattern appears in Denisovan DNA. Modern populations carry Denisovan genetic variants related to high-altitude adaptation, cold tolerance, and immune function. These genes provide clear survival advantages. But the genetic variants that might have carried the essence of Denisovan environmental intelligence, their unique ways of processing spatial and temporal information, their distinctive approaches to problem solving, these are largely absent. It's as if our ancestors conducted a form of genetic editing, preserving only the biological innovations, while systematically eliminating the cognitive diversity that made these other human species unique. We turned them into spare parts for our own evolutionary success. But the most chilling discovery came when researchers began analyzing the timeline of this genetic absorption. The interbreeding between different human species wasn't spread out over hundreds of thousands of years. It was concentrated into narrow windows of time, coinciding exactly with periods of population decline and eventual extinction among non-sapiens human species. This pattern is consistent with what geneticists call demographic replacement with limited gene flow. In plain English, it means conquest followed by selective breeding. The conquering population mates with members of the conquered group, but only under specific circumstances, and only certain genetic lineages are allowed to persist. We see this same pattern in historical cases of colonization and conquest. European colonizers in the Americas often took indigenous women as wives or concubines, but their mixed-race children faced systematic discrimination unless they could successfully pass as European. Over generations, the indigenous genetic heritage was diluted and the cultural heritage was almost entirely eliminated. The same process appears to have played out in prehistoric Europe and Asia, but with consequences far more profound than any historical conquest. Because what was being eliminated wasn't just political independence or cultural tradition. It was entire forms of human consciousness, unique ways of experiencing reality that had taken hundreds of thousands of years to evolve. Recent archaeological discoveries have provided disturbing confirmation of this genetic evidence. At site after site across Europe and Asia, researchers are finding proof of systematic violence directed specifically at non-sapiens human populations. The evidence is subtle but consistent. Neanderthal settlements that were burned not by accident but deliberately, with fire patterns that suggest the structures were destroyed while still occupied. Mass graves containing mixed populations, some showing signs of ritualistic killing rather than warfare casualties. Tool-making sites that were deliberately vandalized, with carefully crafted implements smashed and scattered, as if to prevent their techniques from being learned or copied. Most disturbing of all are sites that show evidence of what researchers euphemistically call selective elimination. Places where adult male Neanderthals appear to have been systematically killed, while females and children were taken captive. This isn't speculation. It's written in the bones, in the demographic patterns, in the genetic signatures of forced integration. Dr. Maria Martinon Torres, director of the National Center for Human Evolution Research in Spain, has spent decades studying these sites. Her conclusions are stark. We're looking at evidence of what can only be described as prehistoric genocide. Not random violence, not territorial disputes, but systematic elimination of competing human populations. Toi. The scale of this elimination becomes clear when you consider the numbers. At the height of their success, Neanderthal populations across Europe may have numbered in the hundreds of thousands. They had successfully occupied the continent for over 300,000 years, surviving multiple ice ages and dramatic climate changes. Their population was stable, their cultures sophisticated, their adaptation to European environments nearly perfect. Yet within just 10,000 years of sustained contact with Homo sapiens, they were gone. Not gradually declining, not slowly being outcompeted, but vanishing so completely that until the 19th century, we didn't even know they had existed. This wasn't natural extinction. This was systematic elimination on a continental scale. The same pattern appears everywhere Homo sapiens encountered other human species. In Asia, Denisovan populations that had thrived for hundreds of thousands of years disappeared within millennia of contact with modern humans. In Southeast Asia, the hobbits of Flores Island, who had successfully maintained their population for over 100,000 years, vanished shortly after the first evidence of Homo sapiens' presence. But perhaps the most revealing evidence comes from studying what happened in areas where different human species managed to coexist for extended periods, because these rare cases of peaceful coexistence show us what might have been possible and make the eventual extinctions even more tragic. In the Levant, the narrow corridor connecting Africa to Eurasia, archaeological evidence suggests that Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens populations lived within a few dozen kilometers of each other for over 50,000 years. During this period, there's clear evidence of cultural exchange. Neanderthal tool traditions show sudden innovations that appear to have been borrowed from Homo sapiens techniques. Meanwhile, early modern human sites show artistic styles and symbolic behaviors that bear striking similarities to Neanderthal traditions. Most remarkably, genetic analysis reveals that most of the interbreeding between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens occurred during this period of coexistence in the Levant. This wasn't conquest and forced mating. This was voluntary interaction, cultural exchange, and mutual learning between different human species. For 50,000 years, it worked. Two different human species, with different strengths, different ways of thinking, different approaches to survival, managed to share the same landscape without destroying each other. They traded, they learned from each other, they even fell in love and raised children together. But this peaceful coexistence came to an abrupt end around 45,000 years ago, precisely when Homo sapiens populations began expanding rapidly out of the Levant into Europe and Asia. As our numbers grew, as our territory expanded, as competition for resources intensified, something changed in our relationship with other human species. The archaeological evidence suggests that this change wasn't gradual. It was sudden and systematic. Sites that had shown centuries of peaceful coexistence were suddenly abandoned. Tool traditions that had been evolving through cultural exchange abruptly stopped. The genetic evidence of interbreeding, which had been continuous for millennia, essentially ceased. What changed? What transformed relatively peaceful coexistence into systematic elimination? The answer may lie in understanding how population pressure affects human psychology and social organization. When human populations are small and resources are abundant, cooperation is advantageous. Different groups can specialize in different strategies, trade with each other, learn from each other's innovations. Diversity is strength because it provides options, flexibility, resilience in the face of change. But when populations grow and resources become scarce, competition intensifies. Differences that were once seen as complementary strengths become perceived as threats. The psychological mechanisms that allowed cooperation between groups are overwhelmed by the need to compete for survival. This is when the darker aspects of human nature emerge. Our capacity for group identity, for distinguishing between us and them, for justifying violence against those we perceive as different or threatening. These traits, which evolved as tools for coordinating large-scale cooperation within groups, become weapons for eliminating competition between groups. Modern psychology has identified this pattern in countless historical and contemporary conflicts. When resources are scarce and populations are under pressure, even minor differences between groups can be magnified into existential threats. Language, religion, ethnicity, even subtle cultural differences can become the basis for dehumanizing the other and justifying their elimination. Now imagine this psychological dynamic playing out between genuinely different human species. Not just different cultures or ethnicities, but beings with different brain structures, different ways of thinking, different approaches to reality itself. The potential for misunderstanding, fear, and conflict would have been enormous. Recent research in evolutionary psychology suggests that humans may have evolved specific cognitive biases that make us particularly sensitive to differences in facial structure, body shape, and behavioral patterns. These biases, which helped our ancestors identify members of their own group and detect potential threats, would have been triggered intensely by contact with other human species. To early Homo sapiens, Neanderthals wouldn't have just seemed foreign. They would have triggered deep-seated psychological responses associated with threat detection and territorial defense. Their robust build, their prominent brow ridges, their different facial structure, all of these features would have registered as not human to cognitive systems evolved to distinguish between group members and outsiders. The same would have been true in reverse. To Neanderthals, the gracile build, small faces, and high foreheads of Homo sapiens would have seemed alien, possibly threatening. The stage was set for conflict, based not on rational competition for resources, but on deep psychological responses to difference itself. But understanding these psychological factors doesn't excuse what happened, because the archaeological evidence makes clear that the elimination of other human species wasn't just the result of unconscious bias or inevitable competition. It was systematic, organized, and deliberate. At multiple sites across Europe, researchers have found evidence of what can only be described as planned campaigns of elimination. Coordinated attacks on multiple Neanderthal settlements simultaneously, strategic destruction of food stores and tool-making sites, evidence of pursuit and systematic hunting of survivors. This wasn't random violence or opportunistic conflict. This was warfare conducted with the specific goal of eliminating competing human populations entirely. The implications are staggering. It means that our species, even in its earlier stages, was capable of organizing and executing campaigns of systematic elimination on a continental scale. We were conducting genocide before we had cities, before we had writing, before we had any of the organizational structures we typically associate with large-scale violence. This capacity for systematic elimination may be one of the defining characteristics of Homo sapiens, one of the traits that allowed us to spread across the globe so successfully. We weren't just better adapted than other human species. We were more ruthlessly efficient at eliminating competition, but the cost of this efficiency was enormous. In eliminating other human species, we didn't just remove competitors. We eliminated alternative ways of being human, different forms of intelligence, unique solutions to the challenges of existence that might have been invaluable to our long-term survival. Today, as we face unprecedented global challenges, climate change, resource depletion, environmental destruction, we're trying to solve these problems with a single form of human intelligence, the only one that survived the prehistoric extinctions. We've reduced human cognitive diversity to a tiny fraction of what it once was, and we may be paying the price for that reduction now. The Neanderthals had survived multiple ice ages. The Denisovans had mastered life in extreme environments. The hobbits had achieved sustainable living on limited resources. Each of these extinct human species had developed solutions to problems we still struggle with today. But instead of learning from them, instead of preserving and integrating their knowledge, we destroyed them. We eliminated the very diversity that might have been our greatest strength in facing the challenges of a complex and changing world. The story of human extinction isn't just ancient history. It's a pattern that continues to shape our world today, influencing how we respond to difference, how we organize societies, how we compete for resources. Understanding this pattern is crucial not just for knowing our past, but for choosing our future. Because buried in our genes, scattered throughout the modern human population, are fragments of these lost human lineages. The genetic heritage of our extinct relatives isn't gone. It's dormant, waiting to be understood and potentially expressed. But recovering this heritage will require more than just scientific advancement. It will require a fundamental transformation in how we think about human diversity and human potential. The question is whether we can learn from our prehistoric mistakes, whether we can choose cooperation over elimination, diversity over homogenization, integration over conquest. Because the alternative, continuing the pattern that led to the extinction of human diversity in the first place, may ultimately lead to our own extinction as well. The final chapters of this story are still being written, not in ancient caves or dusty laboratories, but in the choices we make today about how to treat difference, how to value diversity, and what kind of future we want to create for our species. In the depths of a research facility in Copenhagen, Dr. Eske Willerslev stares at a computer screen displaying what looks like digital noise, endless strings of A's, T's, G's, and C's that represent the genetic code extracted from a piece of ancient bone. But hidden within this apparent chaos is something that will fundamentally change our understanding of human history. The bone fragment came from a cave in the Caucasus Mountains, dated to roughly 35,000 years ago. Standard analysis suggested it belonged to an early modern human, just another piece in the puzzle of our species' expansion across Eurasia. But when Willerslev's team subjected it to advanced genomic sequencing, they discovered something extraordinary. This individual wasn't just Homo sapiens. Their genome contained genetic variants that didn't match any known human population, living or extinct. Variants that suggested the existence of yet another human species, one that had successfully interbred with our ancestors before vanishing entirely from the archaeological record. They called it the Caucasus ghost population, and its discovery opened a disturbing window into just how much human diversity we may have lost without ever knowing it existed. The implications ripple outward like stones thrown into still water. If genetic analysis of a single bone fragment can reveal an entirely unknown human species, how many others are we missing? How many human lineages lived, thrived, and disappeared without leaving behind anything more than ghostly traces in our DNA? Recent advances in ancient DNA extraction and analysis are revealing that the human family tree was far more complex than we ever imagined. Every year brings new discoveries of genetic signatures that don't fit existing models, evidence of human populations that existed but left no fossil record, no tools, no caviomes of their descendants. The technology that paintings, nothing but faint echoes in the gen, makes these discoveries possible is almost miraculous in DNA from bone fragments tens of thousands of years old, from its precision. Scientists can now extract samples taken from cave floors where teeth buried in sediment, even from dirt ancient humans once walked. They can reconstruct entire genomes from genetic material so degraded that individual molecules have been broken into fragments smaller than your fingernail. What they're finding is rewriting the story of human evolution entirely. The neat, linear progression from primitive to modern that dominated textbooks for decades has been replaced by something far messier, far more complex, and far more tragic. Consider what happened in Papua New Guinea, where modern populations carry some of the highest percentages of archaic human DNA found anywhere on Earth. Genetic analysis reveals that these people are the descendants not just of Homo sapiens and Denisovans, but of at least two other unknown human species that once inhabited the region. One of these ghost populations appears to have been highly specialized for life in tropical rainforests. Their genetic signatures suggest adaptations for processing certain plant toxins, for navigating dense jungle environments, for surviving in regions where other human species couldn't establish permanent populations. They were the rainforest specialists, masters of one of Earth's most challenging environments. But they're gone now, absorbed into the expanding wave of modern human populations that reached the Pacific Islands tens of thousands of years ago. All that remains of their unique evolutionary innovations are genetic variants scattered through modern Melanesian populations. fragments of a successful adaptation strategy that took hundreds of thousands of years to develop and was eliminated in just a few millennia. The same pattern appears across the globe. In Africa, genetic analysis has identified at least 3 distinct archaic human populations that contributed DNA to modern human populations before disappearing entirely. In Asia, researchers have found evidence of human species that were so geographically isolated that they developed into entirely separate evolutionary lineages, only to be absorbed or eliminated when expanding populations finally reached their remote territories. Each of these discoveries represents not just a scientific breakthrough, but a profound loss. Because every ghost population identified through genetic analysis represents a unique experiment in human adaptation, a different solution to the challenges of survival in specific environments, a form of human potential that no longer exists. Dr. Sarah Tishkoff, a leading expert in human population genetics, describes the feeling of discovering these ghost lineages. It's like finding the outline of a beautiful building that was demolished before anyone could photograph it. You can see the foundation, you can trace the walls, but you'll never know what it looked like when it was whole. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these genetic discoveries is what they reveal about the speed and completeness of human extinction events. The genetic signatures of these ghost populations are remarkably recent in evolutionary terms. Most date to within the past 100,000 years, with many showing clear evidence of interbreeding with Homo sapiens populations right up until the moment they disappeared entirely. This suggests that the elimination of human diversity wasn't a gradual process spread out over millions of years. It was rapid, systematic, and recent. Within a geological eye blink, the human family tree went from a complex bush with dozens of branches to a single trunk with only minor variations. The speed of this collapse becomes even more remarkable when you consider the timescales involved in human evolution. It takes hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of years, for populations to diverge into separate species. But the genetic evidence suggests that most of these human species were eliminated within just a few thousand years of contact with expanding Homo sapiens populations. What could cause such rapid and complete extinctions? The answer lies partly in understanding the unique characteristics that made Homo sapiens so devastatingly effective at eliminating competition. Recent archaeological research has identified several key innovations that appeared in Homo sapiens populations during the period of rapid expansion and human extinction. These weren't just technological advances, they were entirely new approaches to human organization and environmental manipulation that gave our ancestors overwhelming advantages over other human species. The first was the development of what archaeologists call projectile weapon systems. While other human species use spears and clubs for hunting, Homo sapiens developed spear throwers and eventually bows and arrows that allowed them to kill from a distance with unprecedented accuracy. This wasn't just a hunting innovation. It was a military revolution that made close combat with other human species essentially suicidal. Archaeological sites from this period show clear evidence that these long-range weapons were being used not just for hunting animals, but for warfare between human populations. Projectile points embedded in human bones, defensive structures designed to protect against arrow fire, mass graves containing individuals killed by weapons that could only have been launched from a distance. The second innovation was the development of systematic food storage and surplus management. While other human species had learned to cache food for short periods, Homo sapiens developed techniques for preserving and storing resources on a scale that allowed them to survive extended periods of scarcity and to support much larger populations than the carrying capacity of their immediate environment would suggest. This surplus capacity had military implications as well. Homo sapiens groups could sustain longer campaigns against other human populations, could afford to take casualties in conflicts, could outlast sieges and territorial disputes that would have forced other species to retreat or negotiate. But perhaps most importantly, Homo sapiens developed something that no other human species possessed: the ability to coordinate large-scale social organization across multiple groups and extended territories. While Neanderthals and other human species lived in small, relatively isolated bands, Homo sapiens began forming alliances, trade networks, and cooperative relationships that spanned hundreds of miles. This networking ability allowed Homo sapiens to concentrate overwhelming force against isolated populations of other human species. A single Neanderthal band might face coordinated attacks from multiple Homo sapiens groups simultaneously, making resistance impossible even when the individual groups were evenly matched in terms of numbers and technology. The archaeological evidence for this systematic approach to elimination is subtle but consistent. Neanderthal sites across Europe show signs of being abandoned not gradually, but suddenly, often with evidence of violence. Tool-making traditions that had persisted for thousands of years simply stop, as if the knowledge and skills required to maintain them had been deliberately eliminated. Most chilling of all are sites that show evidence of what researchers call cultural destruction. Places where Neanderthal art, tools, and symbolic objects were deliberately damaged or destroyed, apparently to eliminate not just the people themselves, but any trace of their unique cultural contributions. At Cueva de los Aviones in Spain, researchers found evidence of a Neanderthal workshop where shell beads and pigments were being produced for artistic purposes. The site shows signs of systematic destruction, with finished artworks smashed, pigments scattered, and tools broken in ways that suggest deliberate vandalism, rather than natural decay or accidental damage. Similar patterns appear at Neanderthal sites across Europe. Art that had been carefully created and maintained for generations was deliberately destroyed. Knowledge systems that had been refined over thousands of years were systematically eliminated. Cultural innovations that might have enriched human civilization were targeted for annihilation along with the people who created them. This cultural destruction represents a form of loss that goes beyond mere biological extinction. It's the elimination of entire ways of thinking, unique approaches to creativity and problem solving that had taken hundreds of thousands of years to develop. But the true scope of this loss is only becoming clear now as researchers begin to understand what these extinct human species were actually capable of achieving. Because recent archaeological discoveries are revealing that our extinct relatives weren't just different from us. In many ways, they were more advanced than we've ever been willing to admit. Deep in the caves of Spain, researchers have discovered Neanderthal paintings that predate the earliest known Homo sapiens cave art by more than 20,000 years. These aren't crude finger marks or random splotches of color. They're sophisticated artistic compositions that demonstrate advanced understanding of color theory, spatial relationships, and symbolic representation. At La Pasiega Cave, Neanderthal artists created complex geometric patterns using multiple pigments, with evidence of careful planning and execution that rivals anything produced by early Homo sapiens populations. The paintings show signs of being maintained and modified over centuries, suggesting artistic traditions that were passed down through generations and continuously refined. Even more remarkably, some of these Neanderthal paintings appear to incorporate acoustic properties of the cave spaces where they were created. The images are positioned in locations where sound resonates most effectively, suggesting that they were designed not just for visual impact, but as part of multimedia experiences that combined visual art with music or spoken performance. This integration of art, acoustics, and space demonstrates a level of sophisticated thinking about sensory experience and environmental design that we're only beginning to appreciate in our own artistic traditions. The Neanderthals weren't just making pictures on walls. They were creating immersive experiential environments that engaged multiple senses simultaneously. But their innovations went far beyond art. Recent analysis of Neanderthal tool-making sites has revealed evidence of manufacturing techniques that required understanding of materials, science principles we consider advanced, even by modern standards. At sites across Europe, researchers have found evidence that Neanderthals were creating composite adhesives by combining tree resins, beeswax, and mineral additives in precise proportions. These adhesives were stronger and more flexible than anything achievable with single component materials, and their production required knowledge of chemistry, temperature control, and materials processing that speaks to sophisticated technical understanding. They were also creating the first known textiles, not through weaving, but through a sophisticated process of fiber manipulation that created strong, flexible materials from plant and animal sources. Microscopic analysis of Neanderthal tools has revealed wear patterns consistent with textile production, and some sites contain evidence of dyed fibers that suggest decorative as well as functional applications. Perhaps most remarkably, Neanderthals appear to have been practicing a form of medicine that combines sophisticated knowledge of plant properties with surgical techniques. At multiple sites, researchers have found evidence of successful treatment of serious injuries, broken bones that healed properly, infected wounds that were successfully treated, even evidence of what may have been primitive dentistry. The Shanidar cave burials in Iraq provide some of the most compelling evidence for Neanderthal medical knowledge. One individual, known as Shanidar I, had survived multiple serious injuries, including a crushing blow to the left side of his skull, a withered right arm, and blindness in his right eye. Despite these disabilities, he lived to be approximately 40 years old, ancient by Paleolithic standards, and showed signs of having been cared for by his community throughout his extended recovery. This level of medical care required not just compassion, but sophisticated understanding of anatomy, infection control, and rehabilitation techniques. The Neanderthals had developed a form of healthcare that kept disabled individuals alive and integrated into their communities, something that required both technical knowledge and social organization. But all of this innovation, all of this knowledge, all of these unique approaches to art, technology, and social organization disappeared when the Neanderthals went extinct. The techniques for creating composite adhesives were lost. The artistic traditions that had been refined over thousands of years were abandoned. The medical knowledge that had kept disabled individuals alive in Paleolithic conditions vanished without a trace. The same pattern appears with every extinct human species. The Denisovans had developed high-altitude adaptations that allowed them to thrive in environments where modern humans struggle to survive, even with technological assistance. The Flores hobbits had achieved sustainable living with minimal environmental impact, maintaining stable populations for hundreds of thousands of years without depleting their island's resources. Each of these human species represented a unique solution to the fundamental challenges of human existence. Each had developed approaches to art, technology, social organization, and environmental adaptation that were different from, but not inferior to, our own. And each was systematically eliminated during the period of Homo sapiens expansion across the globe. The result is a world where human potential has been artificially constrained, where we're trying to solve complex 21st century problems with cognitive and cultural tools developed by a single surviving human lineage. We've reduced human diversity to a fraction of what it once was, and we may be paying the price for that reduction in our inability to address the challenges facing our species today. Climate change, environmental destruction, resource depletion, social inequality, these are exactly the kinds of complex, multifaceted problems that might benefit from the cognitive diversity that once characterized the human family tree. The environmental intelligence of the Denisovans, the spatial reasoning of the Neanderthals, the sustainable living practices of the Flores hobbits, All of these might have provided crucial insights for creating a more sustainable and equitable human civilization. Instead, we're left with fragments, genetic ghosts, archaeological traces of what we once were and what we might have become. The question facing us now is whether we can learn from this history, whether we can find ways to recover and cultivate the human diversity that still exists within us, scattered through our genes and waiting to be expressed. Because the story of human extinction isn't over. The same forces that led to the elimination of Neanderthals and Denisovans are still operating today, still driving the homogenization of human culture, still reducing the diversity of human thought and potential. Understanding how and why we lost our human relatives may be the key to ensuring that we don't continue losing the diversity that makes us human. The genetic heritage of our extinct relatives lives on in us, dormant but not destroyed. The question is whether we have the wisdom to recognize it, the courage to cultivate it, and the vision to integrate it into a future that celebrates rather than eliminates human diversity. But to answer that question, we need to understand one final crucial piece of this story, because recent discoveries are suggesting that the extinction of other human species may have had consequences that go far beyond the loss of genetic and cultural diversity. It may have fundamentally altered human psychology itself, shaping the way we think about difference, competition, and our place in the world. The implications of this psychological legacy are still unfolding, but they may hold the key to understanding not just our past, but our future as well. In the summer of 2019, a team of researchers working in the remote mountains of Tibet made a discovery that would force us to confront an uncomfortable truth about what extinction really means. At an altitude of over 3,000 meters, where the air is thin enough to make most people dizzy within minutes, they found something extraordinary embedded in the permafrost. It wasn't a bone or a tool. It was a jawbone, ancient and weathered, with teeth that told a story no one expected to hear. When genetic analysis revealed its identity, the scientific community fell silent. This wasn't just any ancient human remain. It was Denisovan, dating back over 160,000 years. Proof that these mysterious human relatives hadn't just visited high-altitude environments occasionally. They had mastered them completely. The implications hit like a thunderclap. Modern Tibetans, struggling to maintain permanent settlements at these elevations, even with modern technology and medical support, were living in the shadow of a human species that had not only survived, but thrived in conditions that push our physiology to its absolute limits. But here's what makes this discovery truly haunting. The genetic variants that allow modern Tibetans to live at high altitude, the ones that help their blood carry oxygen more efficiently and their hearts pump more effectively in thin air, didn't evolve recently. They're ancient, inherited directly from those vanished Denisovan populations. We're literally surviving in environments our own species couldn't naturally inhabit, using biological innovations borrowed from the very human relatives we eliminated. Think about what this means. Right now, as you breathe easily at sea level, there are people walking the high plateaus of Tibet, whose every breath depends on genetic gifts from a species that no longer exists. Their survival is a living monument to both our greatest tragedy and our deepest hypocrisy. We destroyed the Denisovans, then used their evolutionary innovations to colonize their territory. This pattern repeats across the globe in ways we're only beginning to understand. In the Arctic, Inuit populations carry Denisovan genes that help them metabolize fats and proteins with extraordinary efficiency, allowing them to thrive on diets that would be nutritionally inadequate for most other human populations. These aren't recent adaptations, they're ancient solutions to Arctic survival, developed by Denisovan populations over hundreds of thousands of years, and preserved in the human gene pool long after their creators vanished. In Papua New Guinea, modern populations carry genetic variants from multiple extinct human species that provide resistance to malaria, dengue fever, and other tropical diseases. These immune system innovations represent millions of years of evolutionary refinement, biological solutions to survival challenges that our African evolved immune systems couldn't handle alone. The cruel irony is inescapable. We're colonizing environments across the globe using evolutionary tools we inherited from the very species we eliminated. We're living in their territories, using their adaptations, surviving in their ecological niches, all while maintaining the comfortable fiction that their extinction was inevitable, that we were simply better adapted, more intelligent, more deserving of survival. But recent research is revealing something even more disturbing than this biological colonialism. The psychological impact of eliminating other human species may have fundamentally altered our own mental architecture, creating cognitive biases and behavioral patterns that continue to shape human society today. Dr. Richard Wrangham, a primatologist at Harvard University, has spent decades studying the relationship between human violence and social organization. His research suggests that the systematic elimination of other human species may have triggered what he calls hyper-cooperative aggression, an enhanced ability to coordinate large-scale violence against perceived outsiders. The evidence for this transformation is written in our genes themselves. Humans show unusually low genetic diversity compared to other primate species, suggesting that our population went through what geneticists call a bottleneck, a period when our numbers were dramatically reduced. But this bottleneck didn't happen gradually through environmental pressures. It was rapid and recent, coinciding exactly with the period when other human species were going extinct. This pattern suggests that early Homo sapiens populations may have been selected not just for intelligence or tool-making ability, but for their capacity to organize and execute large-scale elimination campaigns against competing human groups. We became hyper-cooperative within our own species precisely because we were hyper-aggressive toward other species. The psychological mechanisms that allowed our ancestors to coordinate the systematic elimination of Neanderthals and Denisovans are still with us today. Our capacity for group identity, for distinguishing between us and them, for justifying violence against those we perceive as fundamentally different. These traits didn't disappear when the last Neanderthal died. They became part of our core psychological architecture. Modern conflicts often echo the same patterns that led to prehistoric human extinctions. The dehumanization of the enemy, the justification of violence through claims of superiority, the systematic destruction of cultural symbols and knowledge systems. All of these behaviors have deep roots in our species' history of eliminating human diversity. But perhaps the most profound impact of losing our human relatives was psychological rather than genetic. For hundreds of thousands of years, early Homo sapiens lived in a world where they regularly encountered other intelligent beings who were clearly human, but undeniably different. This experience may have fostered a more nuanced understanding of what it meant to be human, a recognition that intelligence and consciousness could take many forms. When those other species disappeared, we lost more than just genetic diversity or cultural knowledge. We lost the mirror that other forms of human consciousness provided, the constant reminder that there were other ways to think, other ways to experience reality, other approaches to the fundamental challenges of existence. Without other human species to compare ourselves to, we may have developed a dangerous form of cognitive narcissism, the assumption that our way of thinking, our approach to problems, our understanding of intelligence and consciousness represents the pinnacle of what's possible. We became trapped in a bubble of our own cognitive limitations, unable to imagine that there might be better ways to process information, solve problems, or understand the world. This cognitive isolation may explain some of humanity's most persistent problems. Our difficulty in addressing long-term challenges like climate change may stem from thinking patterns that evolved for short-term survival in competitive environments. Our struggles with inequality and social cooperation may reflect psychological mechanisms designed for eliminating rather than integrating difference. Recent research in cognitive science is revealing just how much our thinking patterns may have been shaped by this history of elimination rather than integration. Studies of modern human cognition show that we have unusually strong biases toward conformity, toward eliminating rather than celebrating cognitive diversity, towards seeing different approaches to problems as threats rather than opportunities. We're psychologically primed to create monocultures, to eliminate variation, to reduce complexity to simplicity. These traits may have been adaptive when we were competing with other human species for survival, but they may be counterproductive in addressing the complex, interconnected challenges of modern life. The tragedy deepens when we consider what we might have learned from peaceful coexistence with other human species. Imagine growing up in a world where you regularly encountered beings who thought differently, who processed information in fundamentally different ways, who had alternative solutions to the problems you faced every day. Such an environment would have fostered cognitive flexibility, intellectual humility, and creative problem-solving abilities that we can barely imagine today. Instead of seeing difference as threat, we might have learned to see it as opportunity. Instead of trying to eliminate variation, we might have learned to cultivate it. The Neanderthals, with their enhanced spatial intelligence and visual processing capabilities, might have taught us to see patterns and relationships that escape our notice. The Denisovans, with their environmental adaptations and navigational abilities, might have shown us sustainable ways to live in harmony with challenging ecosystems. The Flores hobbits, with their remarkable neural efficiency, might have revealed new approaches to consciousness and cognition that could revolutionize our understanding of intelligence itself. But we'll never know what we might have learned, because we chose elimination over education, conquest over cooperation, homogenization over diversity. We became cognitively impoverished by our own success, trapped within the limitations of a single approach to consciousness and problem solving. The consequences of this cognitive impoverishment are becoming increasingly apparent in our modern world. We face challenges that require forms of thinking we may have systematically eliminated from the human repertoire. Climate change demands long-term environmental intelligence of the kind the Denisovans possessed. Resource scarcity requires the sustainable living practices that the Flores hobbits had perfected. Social inequality might be addressed through the spatial and social intelligence that Neanderthals had developed. But these cognitive tools are largely lost to us, preserved only as fragments in our genetic heritage and archaeological traces in ancient caves. We're trying to solve 21st century problems with cognitive abilities that were shaped by prehistoric competition and elimination, and the mismatch is becoming increasingly obvious. Yet there may still be hope, because while we eliminated other human species, we didn't eliminate all traces of their cognitive heritage. The genes are still there, scattered throughout modern human populations, influencing brain development and cognitive function in ways we're only beginning to understand. Some individuals carry unusually high percentages of Neanderthal or Denisovan DNA, and preliminary research suggests that these genetic variants may be associated with enhanced abilities in spatial reasoning, pattern recognition, or environmental awareness. These people may be living bridges to cognitive abilities we thought were lost forever. More intriguingly, advances in neuroscience and genetic engineering may eventually allow us to reactivate dormant genetic pathways, to express ancient cognitive abilities that have been suppressed for thousands of years. We might be able to recover not just the genetic heritage of our extinct relatives, but their ways of thinking, their approaches to problems, their unique forms of consciousness. This isn't science fiction. The genes are real. The neural pathways they influence are measurable, and the cognitive abilities they once enabled left traces we can study and potentially recreate. The question is whether we have the wisdom to pursue this recovery, the humility to admit that we might learn from the species we destroyed, and the courage to embrace cognitive diversity rather than eliminate it. But recovering this heritage will require more than just scientific advancement. It will demand a fundamental transformation in how we think about human potential, human diversity, and what it means to be human in the first place. We'll need to overcome the very psychological biases that led to the extinction of human diversity in the past. Our tendency to see difference as threat, our preference for conformity over creativity, our assumption that our way of thinking is the only valid approach to reality. The story of our lost human relatives is ultimately a story about choice. At critical moments in our species' history, we chose elimination over integration, conquest over cooperation, homogenization over diversity. But those choices weren't inevitable, and they don't have to define our future. We stand at another crossroads now, facing challenges that may require forms of thinking we've systematically eliminated from human experience. The question is whether we can learn from our tragic history, whether we can choose differently this time, whether we can find ways to recover and cultivate the cognitive diversity that still exists within us. The genetic ghosts of our extinct relatives whisper through our bloodstream, carrying memories of different ways to be human, different approaches to consciousness and cognition, different solutions to the fundamental challenges of existence. Listening to those whispers, learning from those memories, integrating those alternatives into our understanding of human potential. This may be our species' greatest challenge and our greatest opportunity. Because in the end, the story of human extinction isn't just about what we lost in the prehistoric past. It's about what we might still recover, what we might still become, and whether we have the wisdom to choose diversity over conformity, integration over elimination, cooperation over conquest. The bones of our extinct relatives lie silent in museum cases around the world, but their genetic legacy lives on in us. The question is whether we'll continue to ignore that legacy, or whether we'll finally have the courage to embrace the full spectrum of human potential that they represent. The choice, as always, is ours to make. But this time, the stakes couldn't be higher, because the diversity we choose to preserve or eliminate may determine not just our past, but our future as well. The laboratory in Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology falls quiet as Dr. Janet Kelso stares at her computer screen. The data streaming across her monitor represents something that should be impossible. Genetic sequences that don't belong to any known human lineage, living or extinct. But here they are, extracted from a tooth found in a cave in Georgia, telling a story that challenges everything we thought we knew about human diversity. This isn't just another ancient DNA success story. This is evidence of a human population that survived until remarkably recently, perhaps as late as 25,000 years ago, in the mountainous regions between Europe and Asia. They left no cave paintings, no sophisticated tools, no monumental architecture. But they left something far more precious. Fragments of their genetic code preserved in the DNA of modern populations living in the same region today. The researchers have dubbed them the Caucasus population, and their discovery raises a question that keeps archaeologists awake at night. How many more are we missing? How many human lineages lived, adapted, innovated, and disappeared without leaving behind anything more than microscopic traces in our chromosomes? What makes this discovery particularly unsettling is the timeline. 25,000 years ago isn't ancient history in human terms. It's practically yesterday. When these people were alive, Homo sapiens had already spread across most of the globe. We had developed sophisticated art, complex tools, elaborate burial practices. We were, by most measures, fully modern humans. Yet somehow, in the remote valleys of the Caucasus Mountains, another human lineage persisted. They weren't primitive holdovers from an earlier age. Genetic analysis suggests they had been evolving independently for hundreds of thousands of years, developing their own unique adaptations to mountain environments. their own solutions to the challenges of survival in high-altitude regions, with harsh winters and limited resources. And then, sometime around the end of the last ice age, they vanished completely. Not gradually, not through slow absorption into neighboring populations, but abruptly. The genetic signatures that had persisted for millennia simply stop appearing in the archaeological record. What happened to them? The answer may lie in understanding a pattern that archaeologists are finding repeated across the globe during this crucial period in human history. As Ice Age conditions began to ease and human populations started expanding into previously uninhabitable territories, isolated human groups that had survived in refugia for thousands of years suddenly began disappearing. It wasn't climate change that eliminated them. The warming conditions should have made their environments more hospitable, not less. It wasn't natural disasters or disease outbreaks. The genetic evidence shows no signs of population bottlenecks or demographic collapse. Instead, the pattern suggests something far more troubling: systematic contact and replacement by expanding Homo sapiens populations. Dr. David Reich, whose laboratory at Harvard has revolutionized our understanding of ancient human migrations, describes the process with clinical precision. We see the same signature repeatedly across different continents and time periods. Stable populations that had existed for tens of thousands of years suddenly show genetic evidence of admixture with incoming groups, followed within a few centuries by complete replacement. The word replacement sounds sterile, scientific, emotionally neutral. But when you dig into the archaeological evidence that accompanies these genetic transitions, a darker picture emerges. Sites that had been continuously occupied for millennia show sudden breaks in material culture. Tool traditions that had been refined over countless generations abruptly cease. Burial practices that had been maintained for thousands of years are abandoned overnight. This isn't the signature of peaceful cultural exchange or gradual demographic transition. This is evidence of disruption, displacement, and elimination on a scale that's difficult to comprehend. Consider what this means in human terms. Each of these vanished populations represented thousands of years of accumulated knowledge, unique solutions to environmental challenges, distinct ways of understanding and interacting with the world. The Caucasus population, for instance, had developed genetic adaptations that allowed them to thrive in high-altitude environments with extreme seasonal variation. They had learned to read weather patterns, predict avalanches, navigate treacherous mountain terrain in conditions that would challenge modern climbers with advanced equipment. All of that knowledge, all of that hard-won expertise, all of those unique genetic adaptations, gone. Eliminated not because they were unsuccessful or poorly adapted, but because they happened to occupy territories that expanding Homo sapiens populations wanted to colonize. The same story plays out across Eurasia during the late Pleistocene period. In the forests of Eastern Europe, genetic analysis has revealed evidence of human populations that had developed extraordinary abilities to survive in dense woodland environments. They had learned to navigate by subtle changes in vegetation patterns, to predict animal behavior based on forest sounds, to find food and shelter in environments where most humans would quickly become lost and starve. These woodland specialists left genetic signatures in modern Eastern European populations, variants that influence spatial memory, pattern recognition, and environmental awareness. But the populations themselves vanished around 20,000 years ago, precisely when archaeological evidence shows the arrival of new human groups with different tool technologies and settlement patterns. In Central Asia, researchers have identified genetic traces of human populations that had mastered life in extreme desert conditions. Their DNA contains variants that influence water retention, heat tolerance, and the ability to extract maximum nutrition from scarce food sources. These were the desert people, humans who had learned to thrive in environments so harsh that even modern nomadic peoples avoid them. But they too disappeared during the period of late Pleistocene human expansion, leaving behind only genetic echoes in modern populations and archaeological sites that show clear signs of violent disruption. The pattern is so consistent, so widespread, that it can't be coincidental. Across 3 continents and spanning thousands of years, isolated human populations that had successfully adapted to challenging environments were systematically eliminated during the period when Homo sapiens populations were expanding out of their original territories. What made us so effective at this elimination? Part of the answer lies in understanding the unique characteristics that distinguished Homo sapiens from these other human populations. While our competitors had become specialists, perfectly adapted to specific environments, we had become generalists, capable of rapidly modifying any environment to suit our needs. More importantly, we had developed something that no other human population possessed: the ability to coordinate large-scale social organization across vast distances. While isolated populations lived in small, self-contained communities, Homo sapiens had developed networks that allowed us to share information, coordinate actions, and concentrate resources across territories spanning thousands of square miles. When Homo sapiens groups encountered isolated human populations, the outcome was never really in doubt. We could bring overwhelming numerical superiority to bear on any conflict. We could sustain longer campaigns because our supply networks allowed us to support larger populations in the field. We could afford to take casualties because our social organization allowed us to rapidly replace losses. But numbers and organization don't fully explain the speed and completeness of these eliminations. For that, we need to understand something darker about human nature, something that recent research in evolutionary psychology is only beginning to illuminate. Humans appear to have evolved specific psychological mechanisms for dealing with what researchers call near-group competition, conflicts with beings that are similar enough to be competitors, but different enough to be perceived as threats. These mechanisms involve a form of enhanced aggression that's triggered specifically by encounters with groups that occupy a cognitive space between us and them. When early Homo sapiens encountered other human populations, these psychological mechanisms would have been activated with devastating intensity. These weren't encounters with obviously different species like encountering lions or wolves. These were encounters with beings that were clearly human but undeniably different, triggering psychological responses that combined the territorial aggression normally reserved for competing groups with the existential threat response normally triggered by dangerous predators. The result was a form of violence that was both systematic and emotionally charged, driven by deep psychological forces that made complete elimination seem not just strategically advantageous, but psychologically necessary. We didn't just defeat these other human populations, we erased them, eliminating not just their people, but their cultures, their knowledge systems, their very memory. Dr. Steven Pinker, whose work on the psychology of violence has illuminated many of humanity's darker impulses, describes this process with uncomfortable clarity. When humans encounter competitors who are similar enough to trigger group identity mechanisms, but different enough to activate threat detection systems, the result is often not just conflict, but attempted annihilation. The goal becomes not just victory, but elimination of the competitor's very existence. This psychological dynamic helps explain why the elimination of other human populations was so thorough, so complete. It wasn't enough to defeat them militarily or drive them from desirable territories. The very existence of alternative ways of being human seems to have triggered deep psychological imperatives to eliminate the competition entirely. The archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. At site after site across Eurasia, researchers find evidence not just of military defeat, but of systematic cultural destruction. Tool-making sites that were deliberately vandalized, burial grounds that were desecrated, artistic works that were intentionally destroyed. This wasn't random violence or opportunistic looting. This was systematic elimination of cultural memory, deliberate destruction of anything that might preserve knowledge of how these other human populations had lived, thought, or understood the world. The psychological mechanisms that drove these eliminations didn't disappear when the last isolated human populations vanished. They became part of our species' core behavioral repertoire, influencing how we respond to difference, how we organize societies, how we compete for resources. The same patterns that led to the elimination of human diversity in the prehistoric world continue to shape human behavior today. Modern conflicts often echo the same dynamics that drove prehistoric human extinctions. The dehumanization of enemies, the systematic destruction of cultural symbols, the attempt to eliminate not just opposing groups, but the very memory of their existence. All of these behaviors have deep roots in our species' history of eliminating human diversity. But understanding these psychological patterns also offers hope. Because if we can recognize the mechanisms that drive cultural elimination, we can potentially learn to control them. If we understand why humans have such strong tendencies to eliminate rather than celebrate difference, we can work to counteract those tendencies. Recent research in social psychology has identified several key factors that can reduce intergroup violence and promote cooperation across differences. Shared goals that require cooperation between groups. Extended contact under equal status conditions. Recognition of common humanity and shared vulnerabilities. These aren't just theoretical principles. They're practical strategies that have been proven to work in reducing conflict and promoting integration rather than elimination. The question is whether we can apply these principles on a global scale, whether we can learn to see human diversity as strength rather than threat, whether we can choose cooperation over competition when we encounter different ways of being human. Because the story of human extinction isn't over. The same forces that led to the elimination of the Caucasus population, the woodland specialists, the desert people, are still operating today. We're still eliminating human diversity, still reducing the range of human potential, still choosing homogenization over variation. Today, instead of eliminating different human species, we're eliminating different human cultures. Indigenous languages are disappearing at a rate of 1 every 2 weeks. Traditional knowledge systems are being lost as their practitioners are absorbed into global economic systems. Unique ways of understanding and relating to the world are being replaced by standardized approaches based on Western educational models. The result is the same cognitive impoverishment that followed the elimination of other human species in the prehistoric world. We're creating a world where there's only one way to think about problems, one approach to environmental challenges, one model for social organization. But buried in our genes, preserved in our DNA, are fragments of all these lost human populations. The genetic heritage of the Caucasus people, the woodland specialists, the desert masters, all of it lives on in modern human populations, dormant but not destroyed. Recent advances in genomics and neuroscience are beginning to reveal how these ancient genetic variants influence modern human cognition. Some people carry unusually high percentages of DNA from these extinct populations, and preliminary research suggests they may possess enhanced abilities in spatial reasoning, environmental awareness, or pattern recognition. These individuals may be living bridges to cognitive abilities we thought were lost forever. They may carry within their genes the keys to recovering forms of human intelligence that could help us address the complex challenges facing our species today. But recognizing and cultivating this hidden diversity will require a fundamental shift in how we think about human potential. We need to move beyond the assumption that our current way of thinking represents the pinnacle of human achievement. We need to embrace the possibility that there are other forms of intelligence, other approaches to consciousness, other ways of understanding reality that might be superior to our own. The genetic ghosts of our eliminated relatives whisper through our bloodstream, carrying memories of different ways to be human. Learning to listen to those whispers, to recognize and express that hidden diversity, may be our species' greatest challenge and greatest opportunity. Because in the end, The choice between elimination and integration, between homogenization and diversity, between conquest and cooperation, is still ours to make. The question is whether we have the wisdom to choose differently than our ancestors did, whether we can learn from our tragic history of human extinction and create a future that celebrates rather than eliminates the full spectrum of human potential. The bones of the Caucasus people lie buried in remote mountain caves, but their genetic legacy flows through the veins of their descendants. The question is whether we'll continue to ignore that legacy, or whether we'll finally have the courage to embrace the hidden diversity that makes us human. The answer to that question may lie in a discovery made just 3 years ago, in a place where the last whispers of human diversity might still be heard. Deep in the remote highlands of Papua New Guinea, where mist clings to mountain peaks that have remained largely unchanged since the Pleistocene, geneticist Dr. Anna Sapfo Malaspainas made a discovery that would reshape our understanding of what human extinction really means. Her team wasn't looking for ancient bones or stone tools. They were studying the DNA of modern highland populations, trying to understand how humans had adapted to life at extreme altitudes. What they found instead was something far more profound, evidence that the story of human extinction may not be as complete as we thought. Hidden within the genomes of these remote populations were genetic signatures that didn't match any known human lineage. Not Denisovan, not Neanderthal, not any of the ghost populations that had been identified before. These were traces of human groups that had survived in the highlands of New Guinea until remarkably recently, perhaps as late as 15,000 years ago. But here's what makes this discovery revolutionary. These weren't just genetic echoes of long-dead populations. Some of the genetic variants they carried were actively being expressed, influencing everything from lung capacity to blood oxygen levels to cognitive processing speeds. The descendants of these highland specialists weren't just carrying dormant DNA from their ancestors. They were living examples of alternative human adaptations that had somehow survived the great extinctions. Think about what this means. In one of the most remote corners of our planet, forms of human adaptation that were supposed to have vanished tens of thousands of years ago are still alive, still functional, still providing advantages to the people who carry them. We're not just looking at genetic fossils, we're looking at living, breathing examples of human diversity that somehow escaped the homogenization that swept across most of the planet. The implications ripple outward like stones thrown into still water. If highland populations in Papua New Guinea carry active genetic variants from extinct human lineages, what about other remote populations? What about the Inuit of the Arctic, the Berbers of the Sahara, the Ainu of northern Japan? How many other living examples of extinct human adaptations might be walking among us, unrecognized and understudied? Recent genetic surveys of isolated populations around the world are beginning to reveal the answer, and it's staggering. From the mountains of Tibet to the rainforests of the Amazon, from the deserts of Australia to the islands of the Pacific, researchers are finding evidence of human genetic diversity that was supposed to have been eliminated thousands of years ago. These aren't just statistical anomalies or interesting genetic curiosities. These are functioning examples of alternative approaches to human survival, different solutions to the fundamental challenges of existence that our species has faced throughout its history. And they're still working, still providing advantages, still demonstrating that there are multiple ways to be successfully human. But here's the tragic irony. Even as we're discovering this hidden diversity, we're simultaneously destroying it through the same forces that led to the original human extinctions. Globalization, urbanization, cultural homogenization. These modern processes are eliminating the very isolation that allowed alternative human adaptations to survive in the first place. Young people in remote highlands are moving to cities where their unique genetic adaptations provide no advantage. Traditional ways of life that maintained these populations in their ancestral environments for thousands of years are being abandoned for modern lifestyles. The genetic variants that survived the prehistoric extinctions may not survive the modern world. Dr. Sarah Matheson, a population geneticist at the University of Pennsylvania, puts it starkly. We're witnessing the final chapter of human extinction playing out in real time. The last remnants of human diversity that survived the prehistoric bottleneck are now being eliminated by globalization and cultural change. Within a generation or two, they may be gone forever. So here we are, fellow sapiens, at the end of a story that never really ended. We've traveled through deep time together, walked among our lost relatives, felt the weight of what we destroyed and what we might still recover. The bones may lie silent in their caves, but the questions they raise echo louder than ever. Every breath you take carries genetic whispers from species that no longer exist. Every problem we struggle to solve might have had solutions in minds we eliminated. Every challenge we face as a species might be easier if we hadn't reduced human diversity to a shadow of what it once was. The choice is still ours. Will we continue the pattern of elimination that brought us here? Or will we finally learn to celebrate the hidden diversity that still flows through our veins? The genetic ghosts of our lost relatives are waiting for an answer.